Hello, everybody. Today I want to talk about something very different. I know that I said that I was going to do a Raven's Writing Room on fantasy and science fiction, but I want to put that on hold for a little bit and talk about this because this is something that was brought to my attention and I feel a need to address it. I want to talk a little bit today about something that I think is prevalent in world building, and I think it's a problem that many modern authors face. I've spoken at length in these videos about the sins of woke ideology inserting itself into movies, franchises, books, and long running series. But in order for woke ideologies to even be inserted in the manner they are, something has to happen first. That in itself is not conducive to wokeness, but is undoubtedly useful in its application. This is called contradictive writing. Contradictory writing is a practice of writing in which rules and aspects of a story previously established are suddenly overwritten for the purpose of creating an outcome that otherwise could not have been possible. I want to put this as simply and as bluntly as I possibly can. When rules are established for your story, you are bound to those rules. Everything you write thereafter is now at the behest of those established rules. If you've created a world where vampires must avoid sunlight or be burned to a crisp, then that is a rule you are bound to. This seems like it would be something obvious, and yet writers flounder on this all too often these days, especially when writing for franchises like Marvel, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and other long-running titles. Now, why do they do this? There are numerous reasons why these writers pursue the lowest common denominator, and it may be of interest to you to explore and recognize them. The most glaring and obvious reason is that the writers want a specific outcome, but the rules of their story prevent them from achieving it. Rather than backtrack and rethink their world's rules or the story itself, they decide to keep the rules but create a contradiction in the plot so that the rules cave to the needs of the protagonist, usually resulting in what we call a Mary Sue, a character for whom the plot will always bend the knee. As I've said many times before, the Mary Sue is not a character that is perfect in everything they do. They are a character who benefits from a plot who is subservient to them. The plot will ensure their survival, their safety, and their success. In Star Wars The Force Awakens, Rey was captured by the First Order and locked in an interrogation room with no means of escape, with only one guard posted to guard her. She then attempts to use Force mind tricks to trick the guard into letting her go. This scene creates a clear contradiction in the Star Wars universe. The Force is indeed capable of manipulating weak-minded individuals, but here it makes no sense that Rey could not only know how to use this, but know that she could do it in the first place. Rey did not believe that the Force existed until earlier that day, thus her knowledge of the Force should be limited at best and non-existent at worst. The ability to manipulate the mind was something Luke had to be told about by Ben, and then had to train for years in the Force before he could believe in his ability to do it himself. Because that was always the rule of the Force. Whether it's for the dark side or the light side, whether it's for a Padawan or a Master, training is always a priority and a prerequisite. Training was essential for anyone who wanted to use the Force, and Rey has had none of it, and is already using the power she should have no knowledge of. This is contradictory writing. The writers need Rey to rescue herself in this scene, but have written themselves into a corner, so they must now bend the rules of the franchise they are writing to give Rey an out. For the uninitiated viewer, this would be fine, but to the knowledgeable viewer who understands the world we are witnessing, this scene is frustrating as we see the problem that is evident. But let's use another example, one that I bring up often, but that I want to discuss again for the purpose of this discussion point. In Avatar The Last Airbender, there were subcategories of the four bending arts, like blood bending for waterbenders and lightning bending for firebenders. But all of the subcategories require very specific rules to be done at all. The Legend of Korra systematically took every one of these subcategories and undervalued them by contradicting the rules established and making them obsolete. And the two biggest offenders of this were bloodbending and metal bending. But let's focus on bloodbending for this discussion. Bloodbending was an art that allowed a waterbender to manipulate the blood inside someone else and control them. However, the rule stated that only the full moon could give you the power to bloodbend, and the user must still be moving and making the motions of a waterbender to use the technique. It was also such a secretive and evil technique that Katara, the only other bloodbender beside Hama, the woman who taught her how to do it, would likely never pass on knowledge of the technique to anyone. The rules were clear. The full moon is required and motion is necessary. However, in the first season of The Legend of Korra, we're introduced to Amon, an individual who can bloodbend without a full moon and without using any motions or actions. It is literally on the level of telekinesis, controlling the body with nothing but mind alone. This is something that his father was capable of doing, and his brother as well, as it's described as a hereditary ability. This is blatant contradictory writing, as it trashes the rules already established by bloodbending, and many noticed this change, and many were not happy about it. It turned bloodbending into a near unstoppable superpower which could nullify any other bending. In fact, Amon used it to take bending away at times, which was never explained how he could do that. All of this contradicts the rules and creates a narrative disaster for the story. Now, back to the original question. Why do this? Why do writers choose this? What possible reason could there be for contradicting your own rules and established lore? People will give various reasons, creators and fans alike, and most of them come down to the following. It's fiction. None of it matters anyway. You can do whatever you want. This argument is probably one of the most ridiculous, as the person who made it likely hasn't taken the 5 seconds required to think about how easily this can be turned on its head. Yes, in fiction the rules of reality are different from ours, but that's all the more reason why the rules have to be established. Otherwise the audience has no idea what to expect, how to rationalize what they're seeing, or how to understand the stakes. Even in a world of magic and superpowers, rules are essential to understanding the limitations, so we know what can and what can't happen. If we take this argument to its logical conclusion, then what about when we get an avatar who can transform humans into giant lion turtles using avatar spirit magic? Or perhaps we could have a Jedi who has the power to turn into a dragon and burn all the Sith up with fire breath. After all, it's just fiction, and rules don't matter. You can do whatever you want, right? As cool as some of that might sound, no one would be able to take the story seriously, and I doubt that's the intention of the story writers. Lore and rules are constantly evolving and changing. People discover new things all the time, and so the changes in rules should be expected. Yes, it's true that in the real world and in terms of time and progress, rules and understanding of the world allow us to grow and discover new things and new ideas. This is the case with science, discovery, exploration, and even theology. And yes, sometimes we discover new things that contradict previously established things. However, what we have in the cases that I provided above are contradictions without proper explanations of discovery. In the case of bloodbending, perhaps it's feasible that a waterbender might discover a way to bloodbend without the use of the full moon. But where did they learn that bloodbending? Where was it taught to them? Who taught them? And if they did learn this, how are they able to do it without movement? If there was a method of bending where movement wasn't required, wouldn't the other bending arts have learned that trick as well? Why do other bending arts still feel confined to movement when apparently bloodbending allows you to do it with your mind? All other bending styles require some form of motion or movement. The evolution argument falls apart as you start to break down the cause and effect, and you realize there is no cause to create the effect. It's all for the sake of raising the stakes. We don't want a boring story. This argument is the final nail in the coffin for the uninvested, as it completely acknowledges a lack in consistency, but will dismiss it for the sake of raising the proverbial high of the conflict. If the conflict of your story can only be exciting to you by upping the stakes to the point that you break universal rules, then your story is not going to function. If the only way you can make a story engaging anymore is to bend your own rules that you are bound to, then either the rules or the story itself needs adjusting. Once you bend your own rules, it doesn't matter how high you raise the stakes, as stakes no longer matter. The rules are there to identify the limits, and when the limits break, most audience members will no longer be able to know what's possible. Naruto did this quite frequently. Rules about chakra, jutsu, and limitations on them were established early in the series, meaning that ninja were limited and had to make smart and conservative decisions about how much chakra they use, when, and how they use it. But by the end of the series, massive godlike powers are performed so frequently you start to wonder what the limits even are in this world of ninja. So I have no bearing for what is possible and what is not. Yes, you've created more big and epic battles, but it would be nice if I had any idea what was possible for them. It needed to be updated for a modern audience. And this is the argument Hollywood uses often when explaining poor creative decisions, including contradictive writing. When changing the pre-established racial, sexual, and cultural makeup of a world to suit real-world interests and statistics, this is the rationale they use. This argumentation makes the grievous error of assuming that what is timeless is in need of revision, that stories cannot exist on their own without audience inclusion through personal, real-world verisimilitude. The creators said they wanted real-world people to see themselves in the work without realizing that the audience can still connect with characters who look and act nothing like them. It's identity politics at its most toxic, and as we've seen in the box office, it ruins stories. I've said this before in other videos, and I'm sure some people think that I'm beating a dead horse on this point, but I repeat myself only because this is so fundamentally important, and I see this as a repeated problem as I see the decline of Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and several other franchises like Marvel and DC. When you create a world, and you create rules for said world, no matter how fictional, fantasy-esque, or science fiction, you have to abide by the rules you've created. If there's going to be an exception to the rules, you better explain very clearly why and how the exception exists. Cause and effect matters. There has to be rational explanation. If you cannot explain why the rules have changed, if you cannot explain why certain characters are exceptions, then people are going to notice. Rules are not there to limit you and make writing harder. They're there to encourage creativity. Rules exist to encourage the creative mind. Like I said before, if you create a world where vampires are limited by the sun, that just means you have to be more creative in how the vampires get around. Underground passageways for vampires to travel that normal humans don't know about or don't use in the same way, like subway systems. Then, of course, there's also sunscreen, as we saw in the Blade movie. You have to be creative in what you use to make things work for your characters. Many people like to take a look at rules and say, they limit me, therefore they're not good, when in reality, this is the argument and excuse of a very uncreative, uninvested individual. They look at a world and say, this is too hard, I don't like these rules, they make the outcome I want impossible. Then all that means is you need to reestablish what you want to do with your story or reestablish the rules you've created. Do not break your own rules to create an outcome you want. Otherwise, audiences will notice the laziness and no longer be invested in the story. I say this out of the kindness of my heart and out of my love for storytelling. When you make your rules, live with them. Otherwise, your rules need to be adjusted before you start telling a story around them. Thank you for watching my video, and I will see you in my next one. Take care.